Welcome to Raw History. Here we cut through romanticization and speculation to show you the unfiltered reality of human history. During the Second World War, civilians across Europe faced a crisis that extended far beyond the battlefields. Between 1939 and 1945, fuel shortages became so severe that entire populations had to innovate or freeze. In occupied territories and bombed-out cities from Warsaw to Rotterdam, traditional heating systems became luxuries few could afford. Coal was rationed strictly, wood supplies dwindled as forests were stripped bare, and petroleum products went exclusively to military operations. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was life-threatening. Winter temperatures in Central Europe regularly dropped below freezing, and the winters of 1941 to 42 and 1944 to 45 were particularly brutal, claiming thousands of civilian lives across the continent. Out of this desperation came an agricultural technique that farmers had known about for centuries, but urban populations had forgotten. Hay, when stored in large quantities and allowed to decompose in controlled conditions, generates substantial heat through microbial activity. French and Dutch farmers who had long been aware that improperly stored hay could, spontaneously combust, began deliberately harnessing this exothermic reaction. By late 1942, documented cases from the Netherlands show families constructing insulated chambers filled with moistened hay, carefully monitored to produce warmth without reaching combustion temperatures. This wasn't some fringe experiment. Declassified British intelligence reports from 1943 noted the practice spreading through occupied Europe as a genuine survival strategy. The science behind hay heating relies on thermophilic bacteria, which are microscopic organisms that thrive in warm, oxygen-rich environments. When hay is baled with moisture content between 15 and 25%, these bacteria begin breaking down plant sugars and cellulose. This metabolic process releases energy in the form of heat, and under the right conditions, a large hay mass can reach internal temperatures between 130 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit or 54 to 71 degrees Celsius within just 48 to 72 hours. Research published in the Journal of Agricultural Engineering in 1944 documented this process in detail, as scientists in neutral Sweden studied the phenomenon while refugees described the systems they'd built. The wartime implementations varied, but, archival photographs from Dutch resistance museums show the typical configuration. Families would construct wooden boxes roughly 6 feet by 4 feet by 3 feet high, lined with whatever insulating material they could salvage. Old newspapers, rags, or even sawdust. Fresh hay would be loosely packed inside, sometimes mixed with livestock manure to accelerate decomposition. Small ventilation holes allowed oxygen flow while preventing excessive heat loss. Temperature monitoring was primitive but essential. A metal rod inserted into the hay mass and periodically checked by hand served as the thermometer. If it became too hot to touch comfortably, the hay needed turning or additional ventilation to prevent ignition. The danger was real and well documented. Fire department records from Amsterdam show 17 hay-related house fires between November 1942 and March 1943 alone. The key difference between controlled heating and catastrophic fire lies in oxygen management and moisture levels. When hay exceeds 180 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 82 degrees Celsius, it approaches the threshold for spontaneous combustion, especially if pockets of concentrated heat develop. Wartime users learned through tragic trial and error that daily monitoring, adequate ventilation, and never allowing the mass to exceed roughly 4 cubic feet were essential safety measures. Translating this historical practice into modern tiny home construction requires addressing both thermal output and safety with contemporary precision. A typical tiny home of 200 square feet in a temperate climate zone needs approximately 2,000 to 3,000 BTUs per hour to maintain comfortable temperatures during winter months. Laboratory studies conducted at agricultural universities in the 1980s, when researchers briefly revisited composting heat for greenhouse applications, measured heat output from hay decomposition at roughly 15 to 25 BTUs per cubic foot per hour during peak activity. This means a modest hay chamber of 8 cubic feet could theoretically generate 120 to 200 BTUs hourly, insufficient as a primary heat source but potentially valuable as supplemental insulation. The R-value comparison presents an interesting challenge. Traditional fiberglass insulation offers R3.5 per inch of thickness, while spray foam reaches R6 to R7 per inch. Hay itself, when packed loosely, provides only about R1.5 per inch as static insulation, comparable to sawdust or wood chips. However, the active heat generation changes the equation entirely. A 4-inch hay wall generating 160 degrees Fahrenheit internally could theoretically maintain interior wall temperatures 40 to 50 degrees above ambient outdoor temperatures, far exceeding what passive insulation achieves. The catch is durability and consistency. Hay decomposition is most vigorous for the first 2 to 3 weeks, then gradually declines as bacterial colonies consume available nutrients. After roughly 60 days, heat generation drops to negligible levels, requiring complete replacement of the hay mass. Economic analysis reveals surprising competitiveness, at least on paper. Agricultural hay prices in rural American markets average $3 to $6 per small square bale of approximately 3 cubic feet, depending on quality and regional availability. Filling an 8 cubic foot insulated chamber would require roughly 3 bales, costing $9 to $18. Compare this to spray foam insulation at $1.50 to $2.50 per square foot for a 3-inch application, and a 200 square foot tiny home's wall insulation alone could exceed $600 to $1,000. The obvious disadvantage emerges in maintenance. Hay would need replacement every 2 months, creating an annual cost of $54 to $108 per chamber. Multiple chambers would multiply these expenses and labor requirements. The environmental credentials deserve serious consideration. Hay is renewable, typically harvested 2 to 3 times annually from perennial grasses that sequester carbon while growing. When decomposition occurs in controlled systems rather than landfills, the released carbon dioxide represents part of the natural carbon cycle rather than fossil fuel emissions. Biodegradability means no microplastic pollution or toxic chemical off-gassing that plagues synthetic insulation materials. However, methane production during anaerobic decomposition phases could offset some climate benefits if systems aren't properly ventilated. Practical obstacles loom large for widespread adoption. Urban and suburban tiny home dwellers would struggle to source and store hay regularly. The material requires dry storage before use to prevent premature decomposition, adding space requirements. Moisture management becomes critical. Too much dampness invites mold growth and unpleasant odors, while excessive dryness reduces heat generation. Pest attraction is unavoidable. Mice, insects, and other creatures view hay as both food and shelter. Modern building codes present perhaps the most formidable barrier, as no jurisdiction currently recognizes active decomposition systems as approved insulation methods, and obtaining permits would require extensive testing and documentation. The honest assessment is that pure hay heating cannot replace modern insulation in most applications, but it represents valuable proof of concept for biomass thermal systems. The wartime necessity that drove its use has passed, and contemporary materials offer superior convenience and performance. However, the core principle, harnessing controlled biological processes for passive heat generation, deserves modern engineering attention. Imagine sensors monitoring temperature and moisture levels in real time, automated ventilation systems preventing thermal runaway, and genetic selection of bacterial cultures optimized for steady, prolonged heat output. Agricultural waste biomass beyond hay, straw, corn stalks, hemp herds could provide feedstock while solving disposal problems. The real legacy of World War II hay heating isn't a practical blueprint for 2026 construction, but rather a reminder that crisis breeds innovation and that sustainable solutions often draw from pre-industrial wisdom, updated with contemporary knowledge. For off-grid enthusiasts, experimental builders, and those committed to ultra-low-impact living, hay heating might serve as supplemental warmth or a fascinating learning experience. For mainstream adoption, it remains a historical curiosity that illuminates how desperate times pushed ordinary people toward extraordinary resourcefulness. Subscribe to Raw History to explore more forgotten innovations that challenge our assumptions about progress and sustainability. Share this investigation with anyone rethinking conventional building practices, because sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are actually ancient ones waiting for rediscovery.